All right, so have you ever thought about what it would be like to grow up never going to school?
Hmm.
Like no classrooms, no textbooks, nothing.
Yeah, pretty crazy to imagine, right?
Totally. And that's exactly what Tara Westover writes about in her memoir, Educated.
It's a wild story.
Yeah, and today we're going to take a deep dive into it.
We're going way beyond just the basic plot points here.
Right, right. This isn't just a book report.
No, we're going to really dig into some of the bigger ideas about, what education really means.
Definitely, yeah. What it means to be truly educated.
Exactly.
So, like, picture this, okay? Rural Idaho, mountains everywhere.
Okay.
And Tara's family is, like, totally prepping for the apocalypse.
Oh, wow.
And, I mean, they weren't just homeschooling. They were, like, seriously suspicious of the government, modern medicine.
Hmm.
Even just having a birth certificate was, like, a red flag for them. It's
Wow.
really interesting to think about how their belief system was kind of like
Like what?
an epistemic closure,
Oh, yeah, I see what you mean.
where their reality was entirely shaped by what they believed.
Yeah, and their knowledge basically came from, like, their dad and their interpretation of the Bible.
Right, exactly.
It's just wild to compare that with how the academic world works. Like, academics are all about critical thinking and challenging norms and stuff.
Totally. So, obviously, formal education was completely off limits for Tara.
So what does she do all day?
She spent her days working in her dad's junkyard
Oh, wow.
or helping her mom, who's an herbalist.
So, like, no school at all.
Nope. But here's the thing. She had this, like, crazy curiosity, this, like, deep desire to learn.
It's so interesting, though, how that even happens, right?
I know. Like, where does that even come from in that kind of environment?
You would think she wouldn't have that drive at all.
Right.
It's like this testament to how strong the human spirit is. Like, even without traditional education, people still want to understand the world.
I never thought about it like that.
You know?
It's a good point.
Yeah, and for Tara, that spark came from, like, sneaking books or listening to her brother talk about history, things like that.
Right. Anything to get a glimpse outside of the world she knew.
Exactly. And then when she was 17, she made this huge decision.
What's that?
She decided to teach herself enough math and grammar to take the ACT.
Hold on. She taught herself
Yeah.
to take the ACT.
I know.
That's amazing.
Can you imagine, like, trying to figure out algebra and Shakespeare with zero formal training?
No way.
It just shows how resilient and determined she was.
Yeah.
And remember, she's not just, like, learning these subjects. She's also having to, like, unlearn years and years of deeply ingrained beliefs.
Oh, that's true.
It's like she had to learn a whole new language, a whole new way of thinking.
Wow.
And guess what?
What?
She aced the ACT.
No way.
Yeah.
Are you serious?
Yep.
So what happened then?
Well, that opened the door to Brigham Young University for her.
Wow.
A totally different world from everything she'd ever known.
I bet.
It's like, you might think that's where the happy ending starts, right?
Yeah.
But it actually gets even more complicated.
Yeah, I was just going to say that. What happened?
Well, the podcast we listened to touched on this a bit, but we should really dive deeper into it. Think about it. She goes to this university, right?
Right.
And she's surrounded by all these people who are debating ideas, challenging assumptions.
Yeah.
And she spent her whole life being taught to accept just one version of the truth.
Oh, that's got to be tough.
I know, right? It was this constant back and forth between those two worlds for her.
It's kind of like that scene in the book where she's at a lecture about the Holocaust.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
And her family had always dismissed that as, like, government propaganda.
Right.
But then she's confronted with, like, actual facts and evidence.
Yeah.
And her whole world just starts to fall apart.
It's such a good example of how education can, like, really force you to question your most deeply held beliefs.
Yeah. Have you ever had something like that happen to you? Something that just completely changed your perspective?
No, for sure. I think we all have those moments, right? Where something just clicks and you see things in a totally new light.
Totally. And for Tara, that new way of thinking inevitably led to a lot of conflict with her family.
Yeah, that's tough.
Like, the more educated she became, the more she questioned their whole way of life, their beliefs.
Right.
And it was really hard to read about how much that hurt her emotionally.
It's a really powerful exploration of those complicated feelings of loyalty and identity, and the pain that comes with breaking free from the expectations you grew up with.
Totally. Tara's story is so unique, but, at the same time,
Yeah.
it also kind of speaks to something we all go through.
What do you mean?
That whole process of figuring out who we are, especially in relation to where we came from.
Oh, yeah, for sure. We all have to reconcile those two things, right?
Exactly. And then there's her time at Harvard and Cambridge. It's crazy to think about this young woman who was raised in, like, total isolation, now thriving at these top universities.
Right. Like, what are the odds?
But for her, it wasn't just about, getting good grades and stuff.
What was it about then?
It was about discovering her own voice, her own agency.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Yeah. The podcast we listened to really emphasized the contrast between her background and these elite institutions.
Right, which is pretty stark.
But what's even more intriguing to me is how she navigated those spaces.
Like how she didn't try to hide where she came from.
Exactly. She didn't try to erase her past, but she also didn't let it define her.
That's really powerful.
I think it's pretty inspiring.
Oh, absolutely.
She refuses to be a victim. She owns her story, both the good parts and the bad.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what makes Educated more than just typical memoir,
How so?
It's a real testament to the power of education to transform people's lives. And I mean education in, like, the broadest sense of the word.
Yeah, it's not just about, like, memorizing facts and stuff.
No, exactly. It's about questioning, growing, and becoming, like, the best versions of ourselves.
Absolutely.
So, as we wrap up our deep dive here,
Yeah.
I'm super curious, like, what really resonated with you about Tara's story?
That's a good question.
Yeah, and what does being educated mean to you?
That is a good question.
Did anything in her journey, like, challenge any of your ideas about learning and growth?
Definitely some things to think about. And, if you're interested in learning more about Tara's story, I highly recommend you check out Educated.
Yeah, it's a really powerful book.
It's definitely one of those books that stays with you long after you've finished it.
Totally.
And who knows, maybe it'll even inspire you to start your own journey of self-discovery and learning.
Yeah, I think it might.
You never know.
Great episode. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me. It was fun.